Early autumn settled over Hampshire with a deceptive gentleness, gilding the fields around Ashcombe Estate while concealing the strain beneath its ancient stone. The house stood vast and orderly, its windows bright, its gravel swept, yet every corridor carried the quiet anxiety of decline. Tenants paid late, roofs waited for repair, and ledgers bled red ink behind locked doors. At the heart of it all moved the Duke of Ashcombe, only 7 months titled, 27 years of age, and already hardened by expectation. He had inherited land, duty, and scrutiny in equal measure, and he wore authority like armor, believing softness a liability he could not afford. Lady Florence Whitcomb arrived at Ashcombe without ceremony, her name still carrying the faint echo of gentility, though her circumstances no longer abated. At 24, she possessed an education considered excessive for a woman and an intelligence she had learned to veil. Her father's death and the subsequent unraveling of family finances had pressed her into necessity, and necessity had brought her to the estate in the compromised role of overseeing the kitchens. It was respectable enough to avoid scandal, humiliating enough to bruise her pride. She accepted it with quiet resolve, keeping her posture straight and her voice measured, as though dignity might yet be defended by discipline alone. From the first morning, Florence observed what others overlooked. She noted waste in the larders, redundancies in staffing, and the careless arithmetic that allowed small losses to become disastrous ones. She spoke little, listened much, and by candlelight corrected figures no one else questioned. The servants found her distant but fair, the stewards faintly unsettled by her precision. None suspected the breadth of her knowledge, least of all the Duke, who passed her daily without recognition, seeing only a woman out of place and beneath notice. Their collision came not in a ballroom or a garden, but in a service corridor where the air smelled faintly of bread and damp stone. The Duke, already irritated by mounting correspondence and political pressure, summoned Florence on a matter of staffing. She stood before him with hands folded, her expression composed. He did not offer her a chair. His words were swift, clipped, and devastating. "You are not cook material," he said, his voice carrying without effort. "Leave by dawn." The phrase fell like a verdict, audible to those who pretended not to listen, sealing her reduction from necessity to failure. Florence felt the heat of humiliation rise, yet she did not plead. To do so would confirm the judgment he had already passed. She inclined her head, thanked him for the opportunity, and withdrew with controlled steps that only faltered once she reached the privacy of her narrow attic room. There, amid a single trunk and borrowed linens, she allowed herself one breath of grief. Not for the position alone, but for the relentless narrowing of her world, where competence could be erased by perception. As evening descended, Ashcombe glowed with lamplight, unaware of the quiet industry continuing above the servants' quarters. Florence packed methodically, setting aside the few dresses that still bore signs of better days. Before extinguishing her candle, she returned to the household accounts spread upon her small table. One column remained unresolved, a discrepancy she could not leave untended. She corrected it carefully, annotating the margin in her neat hand, an unconscious act of loyalty to a house that had not shown her the same. Below, the Duke dined alone beneath portraits of ancestors who seemed to watch with unsympathetic eyes. He told himself dismissal was efficiency, not cruelty, and yet the memory of her composed silence troubled him more than protest would have done. Outside, the wind stirred fallen leaves against the windows, and dawn crept closer. Florence closed the ledger, wrapped her cloak around her shoulders, and prepared to depart, unaware that the order she had restored would speak for her after she was gone. She sat briefly on the edge of the bed, considering how swiftly a life might be redirected by a single sentence uttered without malice, only certainty. She thought of the education she had once been praised for, the books now stored away, the careful shrinking of herself required to survive. Somewhere below, footsteps echoed, doors closed, and the house settled into sleep, confident in hierarchies it never questioned. Florence extinguished the candle at last, committing her resolve to darkness. Whatever awaited her beyond Ashcombe's gates, she would meet it with the same restraint she had shown within its walls, carrying with her a mind sharpened by necessity and a dignity no dismissal could fully strip away. The estate breathed on, ignorant of the quiet turning already begun, while the night held its secrets and delayed, by mere hours, the consequences of mourning inevitably. Morning broke over Ashcombe with an air of unexpected order. The servants moved with uncommon confidence, fires lit on time, stores inventoried, meals prepared without the usual wasteful excess. Outside, a carriage rolled through the gates bearing a county magistrate accompanied by an agricultural advisor, men whose visits were rarely ceremonial and never comforting. The Duke received them with habitual reserve, prepared for criticism, already rehearsing explanations for failures he scarcely understood himself. Instead, praise met him. The advisor remarked upon improved yields, rational storage, and a balance between expenditure and provision that suggested deliberate reform. The magistrate noted fewer tenant complaints, clearer records, and an estate that seemed, at last, competently governed. The Duke listened in disbelief, his expression carefully schooled, while unease gathered beneath his composure. None of these improvements had been ordered by him. None had crossed his desk. Summoned at once were the stewards, who exchanged uncertain glances before producing ledgers marked with precise annotations. The handwriting was unmistakable. A name surfaced reluctantly, spoken as though it carried risk. Lady Florence Whitcomb. The Duke felt the sting of recognition sharpen into something like shame. Only hours earlier, he had dismissed her with careless certainty, reducing her to a function she had never truly served. Florence, meanwhile, descended the servants' stairs with her small case in hand, intent on leaving before she might be stopped by sentiment. She was intercepted halfway by a footman bearing a summons she could not refuse. When she entered the morning room, the presence of strangers made the space feel suddenly hostile. She curtsied, composed but wary, her future balanced upon assumptions she could not yet challenge. The Duke addressed her formally, asking questions rather than issuing commands. Florence answered with restraint, explaining her methods without embellishment, citing texts, experience, and observation rather than ambition. She did not claim authorship of success, only responsibility for care. The magistrate listened with interest, the advisor with admiration thinly veiled. In their measured nods lay a validation Florence had long ceased expecting. When the visitors departed, satisfaction evident, silence reclaimed the room. The Duke stood opposite Florence, authority and uncertainty warring within him. He returned her cloak, folded carefully over his arm, and informed her that her departure would be postponed. The word temporarily hung between them, neither apology nor promise. Florence accepted it without gratitude, sensing the fragility of the reprieve. Word traveled swiftly through Ashcombe. A woman of diminished rank consulted on estate matters invited speculation, and speculation bred judgment. Servants whispered of favoritism, stewards of impropriety, though nothing had occurred beyond conversation and competence. Florence felt the weight of scrutiny press upon her more keenly than before. To remain was to risk reputation. To leave would erase her contribution entirely. That evening, the Duke reviewed the accounts alone, tracing Florence's handwriting as though it were evidence of an intelligence he had chosen not to see. He recognized now the cost of his haste, yet pride restrained confession. Across the house, Florence sat quietly, aware that her mind had secured her place but imperiled her safety. The estate rested between old order and uneasy change, and both of them sensed that what had begun as correction had become something far more dangerous, inviting consequences neither could yet foresee. The night deepened, and with it the scrutiny, as Florence retired, knowing every step echoed louder than before. She understood that usefulness invited dependence, and dependence bred resentment, especially where rank was unsettled. The Duke, restless in his chambers, confronted an unfamiliar discomfort, the knowledge that authority exercised without attention could wound unjustly. He did not yet frame it as remorse, only as disturbance. Beyond the windows, the estate lay calm, barns aligned, kitchens silent, fields measured and waiting. Order had been restored, yet peace had not followed. Each had glimpsed the other anew, not as dismissal or subordinate, but as consequence. Morning would demand decisions, explanations, and courage neither had prepared to summon. Until then, Ashcombe held its breath, balanced between preservation and change, while two lives, briefly intersecting, began to alter the direction of the house they served. Florence lay awake, considering the peril of being seen too clearly in a world that preferred women unnoticed. The Duke, equally wakeful, stared at the ceiling, haunted not by debt alone, but by the realization that competence, once revealed, demanded response. Neither slept easily. In silence, ambition and fear pressed close, and respect began its slow, unwelcome formation. The distance between command and understanding narrowed, inch by uncertain inch. Dawn approached again, no longer an ending but a threshold, promising consequence instead of escape, and carrying with it the quiet certainty that what had been postponed could no longer be undone. History watched silently as private choices prepared to challenge the permanence of tradition itself. Evenings settled over Ashcombe with deliberate slowness, as though the house itself hesitated before night. Lamps were lit one by one, casting warm circles upon polished wood and bound volumes, and the corridors grew hushed. Florence was summoned to the Duke's study after supper, a request phrased with restraint yet weighted by implication. She entered with composed caution, aware that privacy, in such a house, was never innocent. The study bore the marks of inherited authority: tall shelves, a broad desk, and the quiet severity of order imposed rather than earned. The Duke stood by the fire, holding a ledger open, its pages dense with figures she knew by heart. He did not ask her to sit at once. Instead, he spoke of numbers, of yield and waste, of how competence might emerge unnoticed until absence revealed its value. Florence listened without interruption, recognizing in his measured tone the strain of a man confronting his own inexperience. When at last he gestured to a chair, it felt less command than concession. She explained her methods carefully, avoiding presumption, framing reform as stewardship rather than challenge. The Duke questioned her closely, not with suspicion but with genuine inquiry. In the exchange, rank loosened its grip, replaced by something quieter and more unsettling. Respect forming in real time. Firelight shifted across the room, illuminating moments of shared understanding and hesitation alike. Florence spoke of responsibility learned through loss, of how necessity had sharpened her attention. The Duke, after a pause, admitted he had inherited a title without instruction, expected to govern by instinct alone. The confession altered the air between them. It was not an apology, yet it acknowledged error, and Florence felt the subtle weight of being trusted with it. He rose and placed before her a set of keys and the estate's full accounts, granting access rarely extended beyond blood. The gesture was deliberate, irreversible. Florence accepted them with steady hands, aware that such trust could not remain private for long. In that moment, partnership flickered into possibility, though neither named it. Their conversation was interrupted by distant laughter drifting from the house, a reminder of society's nearness. The Duke mentioned obligations awaiting him, alliances proposed, expectations spoken by others with confidence he did not share. Florence understood at once. Her presence, however discreet, threatened plans older than affection. She thanked him for the opportunity and stood, already withdrawing in spirit. Later, alone in her chamber, Florence weighed the cost of remaining. She had achieved recognition she had never sought, yet it bound her closer to danger. To be useful was to be visible, and visibility invited judgment. Down the corridor, the Duke lingered in his study, unsettled by the realization that admiration had crossed into something far less containable. When news reached Florence that evening of impending negotiations for the Duke's marriage, spoken casually by servants who assumed her ignorance, clarity followed resolve. She packed again, more quietly than before, determined to leave before sentiment complicated reason. Dawn would be her ally this time. The Duke discovered her intention by absence, by the unanswered summons and the unopened ledger. He understood then that authority granted too late could wound as deeply as authority misused. Standing alone amid the symbols of his station, he recognized the narrowing path ahead, one demanding choice rather than inheritance. Florence descended the stairs before first light, pausing once at the threshold between service and departure. She carried no resentment, only the knowledge that dignity sometimes required retreat. Behind her, Ashcombe slept uneasily, sheltering a man who had begun to question the limits of command and a woman whose silence had reshaped his understanding. As she stepped into the cool air, uncertainty pressed close, but so did resolve. She had offered her mind freely and would not bargain it for affection half-spoken. Within the house, the Duke stood at his window, watching the horizon pale, aware that restraint had cost him more than any breach of decorum might have done. The space between them stretched, charged with what remained unsaid, promising confrontation or surrender yet to come, and ensuring that the morning would not pass quietly for either of them. History watched silently as private choices prepared to challenge the permanence of tradition itself. Their separation, brief though it promised to be, hardened resolve on both sides, for Florence would not return without honor intact, and the Duke would not retreat again in a certainty borrowed from ancestors, knowing now that silence had shaped his future as surely as any declaration he might yet dare to speak aloud. In that fragile pause, power, affection, and conscience aligned imperfectly, setting the stage for a reckoning neither rank nor restraint could indefinitely postpone, despite every lesson taught by the age. Change waited, patient and unavoidable. Florence had nearly reached the gates when the sound of hurried footsteps cut through the stillness. The gravel shifted behind her, and she turned to see the Duke approaching without coat or hat, the morning air sharp against his resolve. He called her name once, not loudly, but with a gravity that stopped her entirely. When he reached her, breathless and unguarded, the distance between command and confession collapsed at last. He did not begin with apology, though it hovered near. Instead, he spoke of error plainly, acknowledging how easily authority had blinded him to worth. His voice, stripped of formality, carried a steadiness earned through choice rather than habit. Florence listened, guarded but attentive, sensing the sincerity beneath restraint. She replied with care, stating that respect demanded action, not sentiment, and that she would not remain where her presence served convenience alone. The Duke answered by offering something no inheritance could supply. He spoke her contributions aloud, crediting her reforms without qualification, declaring that Ashcombe's recovery bore her mark indelibly. He confessed that marriage proposed to him promised stability, but not partnership, and that for the first time he understood the distinction. The words were not grand, yet they held weight enough to alter fate. Florence hesitated, pride and longing contending fiercely. She demanded clarity, insisting she would not be elevated as charity nor concealed as embarrassment. The Duke met her gaze without flinching, stating that he sought not rescue, but alliance, and that he would accept the cost of honesty before society. In that exchange, dignity was preserved on both sides. By midday, word had spread through the house of a declaration unexpected and unsettling. The Duke summoned stewards and tenants alike, acknowledging Florence's role openly and decisively. Murmurs followed, some admiring, others indignant, yet the authority of conviction silenced dissent. Florence stood beside him, not as ornament but as equal, her composure unwavering. When he proposed, it was without audience, beneath the old oak that marked Ashcombe's boundary. He spoke not of love's fire, but of shared labor, of decisions made together and burdens borne jointly. Florence accepted not with surrender, but with resolve, recognizing in his words a future grounded in mutual respect. Their hands met briefly, the gesture restrained yet irrevocable. The marriage, when it came, was modest and deliberate, held beneath autumn skies softened by time. Guests arrived curious rather than celebratory, witnessing a union that defied quiet expectation. Florence wore no borrowed splendor, only assurance earned through trial. The Duke stood, altered, authority tempered by understanding. Life at Ashcombe changed subtly thereafter. Accounts balanced, tenants prospered, and the house learned a new rhythm shaped by collaboration rather than decree. Society adjusted reluctantly, compelled by success to tolerate what it could not easily dismiss. Florence moved through her days with confidence unshadowed by apology, her intellect finally unhindered. At dusk, the estate rested peacefully, fields secure, halls warmed by purpose. The Duke and Duchess walked together along the grounds, conversing as partners, their future shaped not by accident of birth, but by deliberate choice. Love, in their keeping, proved not a rebellion against tradition, but its careful reformation. The world beyond Ashcombe remained cautious, yet within its walls, dignity and affection endured, bound by courage and respect.